Della Calloway buried her father on Tuesday. By Friday, they'd moved her out of the house he raised her in. They carried her cot across the yard to the bunkhouse while the sun was still low. She did not weep in front of them. She watched her narrow bed go out the door she'd been carried through as a baby, and she set her jaw, and she said nothing. That Friday night, at the long supper table, her uncle Josiah slid her plate to the far end. He did it slow, so the whole room could see. Then he told them all, near 30 hands and the whole gathered kin, a girl with no name has no claim to this dirt. Across the yard, through the open door, the gray old foreman set down his coffee. Amos Teague. 40 years on that ranch. He looked at Della a long, quiet moment. So I want you to remember him. Remember the man who'd been on that ground longer than any Calloway alive. If you've ever been made to feel you had no name, no place, and no right to what was already yours, this story is for you. Before we ride into it, do this one thing for me. Subscribe, so you don't miss how it ends. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one rides. Now let's go back to the beginning. She was born on the trail. That's where the whole thing starts. And it matters, so hold on to it. Emmett Calloway drove cattle north in the spring of 1864, and his young wife Ada rode beside the wagon, heavy with child. She was not strong. The country was hard, and the water was bad, and somewhere south of the Powder River, she went into her labor early. Emmett held her hand through the whole long night. By morning, he had a daughter. By noon, he had a grave. He buried Ada under a lone cottonwood, and he cut her name into the bark with his knife. Then, he wrapped the baby in his own coat, and he rode on north, because a man with cattle and no wife still has to move them or lose everything he owns. He named the girl Della. He raised her himself. There was no woman in that house after Ada. There was Emmett, and there was the land, and there was the child growing up in the middle of both. He never remarried. He never so much as courted. When folks asked him why, he'd say he'd had his one good marriage, and he wasn't fool enough to think he'd get another. The ranch was the Bar C, out past Cold Fork in the Wyoming Territory. A hard, beautiful piece of ground. High grass in the bottoms, and pine on the ridges, and a creek that ran cold even in August. 900 head of cattle when the count was good. It was Emmett's whole life, and he built it with his hands, and he meant for it to be Della's. He taught her everything. She could ride before she could properly walk. She could rope a calf at 7. She knew the country the way she knew her own name, every draw and every spring and every place the cattle liked to shade up in the heat. And she knew the brand. The Bar C, a bar over a C, burned into every hide on the place. Emmett was proud of that mark the way some men are proud of a coat of arms. It meant something. It meant this animal, this land, this family. She remembered the first time he let her hold the iron. She was 6. The forge was going in the shed, and the iron sat in the coals till the tip glowed a dull red, and Emmett wrapped his big hand around her small one on the handle. Together they pressed it to the calf's flank. There was the smell and the sound and the little cloud of smoke, and then there was the mark, clean and true. You press it steady, he told her. You don't drag it, and you don't flinch. You put your name on a thing, you do it right. She never forgot that. Not the words, and not the weight of his hand over hers. That was the life. Just the two of them, and the ranch and the seasons turning over, year after year. She grew up sunburnt and strong and sure of exactly who she was. She was Emmett Calloway's girl. Everybody in Cold Fork knew it. There wasn't a soul who'd have said different. And then, 5 weeks before this story truly begins, Emmett got caught out in a cold spring rain, bringing strays down off the North Ridge. The chill went into his chest. It turned to pneumonia. He was a strong man, but he was not young anymore, and the sickness got ahead of him fast. He was down 11 days. Della barely left his side. She fed him broth and kept the fire built up and listened to the terrible sound of his breathing, and on the 12th morning the sound stopped. She was 18 years old, and she was alone. She buried him next to no one, because Ada was 1,000 miles south under a cottonwood, but she buried him proper, up on the little rise where you could see the whole spread. Half the county came. Emmett Calloway had been a fair man and a square dealer, and folks knew it. There's one more thing from those first quiet days you need to keep. It came and went in a breath, so most people would have missed it. The morning after the funeral, old Amos was in the tack room, oiling a bridle, his hands moving slow the way they did when he was thinking. Della was sitting on a saddle rack with nothing left in her, just staring at the wall. "Your daddy was a careful man," Amos said, not looking up. He wiped the leather in long strokes. "Kept the good book out here in the tack room, you know, not up at the house. Said a man's word belonged where he did his work." She didn't answer. She barely heard it. It was just an old man talking to fill a hard silence. But he'd said it. Remember that he said it, because 3 days after the funeral, a wagon came up the Bar C road that Della didn't recognize. And her whole world tilted. The man driving it was her uncle Josiah, Emmett's younger brother. She'd met him maybe twice in her life, both times years back. He was a lean, hard-eyed man of 51, with his brother's jaw and none of his brother's warmth. Beside him on the seat sat his son Royce, 24, handsome in a cold and glossy way, wearing town clothes and a look like he already owned the place. Behind them came 2 more wagons. Josiah had not come to grieve. He'd come to move in. "I'm next of kin," he told Della, standing in the yard, not even asking to sit down and talk it through. "My brother's gone, God rest him, and there's no man to run this place. That falls to me now, blood to blood." Della stood very straight. "I'm his daughter." Josiah looked at her the way you'd look at a fence that needed mending. "We'll see about that," he said. And he walked past her into her father's house like he'd built it himself. She didn't understand yet. Not fully. She thought maybe there'd been some mistake, some paper to sign, and it would all get sorted. She was 18, and she'd never had cause to doubt who she was. She learned quick. That first night, they gave her the small back room, which stung but which she could bear. The second night, they didn't. On the second morning, she came in from the barn and found 2 of Josiah's men carrying her cot out the front door. "Uncle Josiah says the house is for family," one of them told her, not unkind, just doing what he was told. "You're to bunk out in the bunkhouse with out there. The bunkhouse, where the hired hands slept." Della stood in the yard and watched them carry her bed across it, past the well, past the forge, out to the long, low building where 30 rough men snored and spat and swore. They put her cot in a corner and hung a horse blanket on a rope for a wall, and that was to be her room now, in the house her father built. She did not cry. I want you to know that. She wanted to. There was a scream sitting up under her ribs the whole time. But she'd been raised by a man who said, "You don't flinch," and she wasn't going to give them the sight of her breaking. She squared her shoulders, and she hung her few things on the nails behind the blanket, and she went out to work the herd, because the cattle didn't care whose name was on the deed, and they still needed tending. That was the first wound. A private one. Small, if you're the kind of person who thinks a bed is a small thing. The second came at supper, and it was public, and it was worse. The whole kin ate at the long table in her father's house, Josiah at the head now in Emmett's chair, and Royce at his right hand, and aunts and cousins Della barely knew filling the benches. She was allowed to eat there still, in those first days. Down at the low end. And on the third night, Josiah stood up before they'd even said the blessing, and he had something in his hands. It was Emmett's hat. Della knew that hat the way you know a person's face. Dark felt, sweat-stained, The brim curled just so from 20 years of her father's hands. It had hung on the peg by the door her whole life. Josiah held it up so everyone could see, and then he set it down on Royce's head. "A ranch needs a young man to run it," Josiah said. "My boy'll carry the Calloway name forward here." Royce grinned under the brim. He tipped it back with one finger, easy, like it had always been his. And then Josiah said the rest. "The sorrel's his too. Fine animal, no sense it going to waste." The sorrel, Della's father's horse. The one Emmett had raised from a foal and ridden 10,000 miles. Della had helped break that horse. She'd fed him by hand. One of the hands down the table, an older fellow named Pruitt, who'd known Emmett 30 years, went still and looked at his plate. He didn't say anything. But Della saw him see it. She saw one honest man in that room understand exactly what was being done to her and be too afraid of losing his place to speak. That look almost undid her more than the hat did. She kept her eyes down and she kept eating, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't come out as begging, and she would not beg. It was that same night the kin said out loud what they'd been building toward. She heard it through the thin wall as she carried dishes. "There's no record," Josiah was telling the older cousins, low and satisfied. "I had a man check. Emmett and that woman married on the drive in '64. Some circuit preacher. Dead these 20 years. No courthouse anywhere in the territory. No license, no register, nothing on paper." A pause. The scrape of a chair, which means there was no lawful marriage. And no lawful marriage means that girl is no lawful daughter. She's got no more legal claim to this ground than a stray dog. It passes to me. Clean, Della stood in the dark hallway with a stack of plates in her hands and felt the floor go out from under her. That was the theory. That was the whole cold machine of it. Her mother and father had married 1,000 miles from any courthouse, before a preacher long in his grave, and no piece of paper anywhere said it ever happened. And on the strength of that missing paper, a man she'd met twice in her life was going to take everything. And there was money in it too. That same night, she heard the number. The Cold Fork Cattlemen's Bank held a note on the Bar C, $4,200, borrowed against the herd in a lean year, and it was coming due in 30 days. Josiah had it all figured. He'd sell 200 head to clear the note, and keep the other 700, and the land under them, and be a rich man on his dead brother's work before the first snow. Everything her father built. Gone in a month, on a technicality, to a man who never rode a mile of it. Della lay awake in the bunkhouse that night behind her horse blanket wall, listening to strangers snore, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to just let it happen. There had to be a place you went. An office. A lawful thing you did. You filed a claim. You put it in front of the authorities, and you said, "This is mine by right." And the law sorted it out. She believed in that. She was 18, and she believed that if you were in the right and you brought it to the proper office, the truth would carry. She rode into Cold Fork 4 days later to file her claim. Now this is the part that's hard to watch. I'll tell it to you straight, the way it happened, because you need to feel the low place before the ground turns. The land office in Cold Fork was a single room with a counter and a big ledger and a clerk named Dawes behind it. And it was full. That was the first thing Della didn't understand. It was full of townsmen, a dozen of them or more, standing around like they'd come for a show. And she realized, walking in with her hat in her hands, that they had. Word had gone ahead of her. Josiah had made sure of it. Josiah was already there. So was Royce, still in Emmett's hat. And so was a lawyer, a soft, careful man from the county seat named Vance, in a good coat, with a leather case. Della went up to the counter anyway. Her voice was steady. "I've come to file a claim on the Bar C ranch. I'm Della Calloway. Emmett Calloway was my father. I'm his heir." The clerk Dawes looked at her, and then he looked past her at the lawyer Vance, and Della understood that this had all been arranged before she ever walked in. Vance stepped up smooth as oil. "Mr. Dawes, if you'd be so good, the county marriage register. Let's just have the truth in front of everyone. Plain." Dawes brought out the big ledger and opened it and turned it around on the counter so the room could see. He ran his finger down a page and turned it and ran it down the next. "No Calloway marriage recorded," he said. "Not that year. Not any year. They married on the trail," Della said. "There was a preacher, was there?" Vance said gently, and it was worse than if he'd shouted. "Who witnessed it? Where's the license? Where's the register? Miss, I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but the law doesn't run on stories. It runs on the record. And the record is empty." He closed the case with a soft click. "There is no lawful marriage here. There is no lawful daughter. There is nothing to file." Dawes shut the ledger. The sound of it was very loud in that room. And the townsmen watched, a dozen men she'd known her whole life, men who'd tipped their hats to Emmett Calloway on the street, and not one of them said a word. They just watched an 18-year-old girl get told in front of everybody that she was nobody's daughter. Della's face went hot. Her eyes stung. But she did not cry. She would not cry in that room. She picked up her hat off the counter, and she turned around, and she walked toward the door with her back straight and her chin level, past all those staring men, and she made it. She made every step of it without breaking. Josiah couldn't leave it there. He followed her out onto the office steps, into the daylight, where the street could see, and he said it loud enough for the whole town to hear. "A girl with no name has no claim to this dirt." They laughed. Some of them. Royce laughed, under her father's hat, and a couple of the others took it up. That ugly, easy laughter of people who've decided which way the wind blows and want to be on the right side of it. Della kept walking, down the steps and across the street to where the sorrel, her father's sorrel, that Royce hadn't bothered to ride in, stood at the rail. She untied it, and she mounted up, and she rode out of Cold Fork at a walk, not a trot, because a trot would have looked like running. She held that walk until the town was behind her and out of sight. And then, only then, out on the empty road with no one to see, did she stop. She sat the horse in the middle of the road, and she let herself shake for a minute. Not crying, even then, just shaking, the way you do when something's been pulled up in you by the roots. She'd done it right. She'd gone to the proper office and stood in the proper place and told the truth, and the truth hadn't carried at all. The paper had beaten her. There was no paper, and so there was no her, and that was the law. She thought it was over. Here's where the ground turns. Stay with me. She rode home the back way, not wanting to face the yard, and she came in past the outbuildings, and she got down to walk the sorrel the last stretch because she couldn't yet stand to be seen. And that path took her past the tack room. The door was open. Amos was inside. The old foreman was sitting on an upturned keg with a bridle across his knees, not working it, just holding it. He'd heard, of course. Everyone had heard. He looked up when her shadow crossed the door, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not pity. Something harder and more decided than pity. "Come in here a minute, girl," he said quietly. "Shut the door." She came in. She shut the door. The tack room was dim, and it smelled of leather and neatsfoot oil and old wood, the way it had smelled her whole life. Almost set the bridle aside. He got up slow, his knees not what they were, and he went to the far corner where the spare gear hung, and he moved a stack of worn saddle blankets off a low shelf. Behind them was a wooden box, plain, the kind you'd keep horseshoe nails in. He lifted it down and set it on the workbench and opened it. He took out a book. It was a Bible. Old, thick, the leather cover dark and soft with handling, the corners worn round. Della knew it. She'd seen it in her father's hands 100 times when she was small, and then not for years, and she'd never once wondered where it went. "Your daddy kept this out here," Amos said. "You remember I told you." Said his word belonged where he worked, not up in the house where anybody might poke around. He said it in front of her. His old hands were not quite steady. Open it to the front. The family page. Della opened it. The spine was soft, and it fell open easy to the middle, where the printed pages gave way to the ruled ones the family kept its records on. Births, deaths, and marriages. There, in ink gone brown with 20 years, in a hand she'd have known anywhere, because it was her father's, it said. Emmett James Calloway, wed to Ada Marie Sumner, this 11th day of May, 1864, on the trail north, Powder River country, and beneath it, a line for the witness. And on that line, in a different hand, older and rougher, witnessed, Amos Teague. Della couldn't breathe for a second. She put her finger under her mother's name, Ada Marie, and she looked up at the old man. "You were there," she whispered. "I was there," Amos said. "I stood up beside your daddy when that preacher married them. Reverend Coy it was. Dead now these long years, you're right about that. But he was real, and the marriage was real, and I watched it with my own 2 eyes, and I signed my own name to it not an hour after. His jaw worked. There was a lawful marriage. Girl, whatever that lawyer says. Whatever that book in town don't say. It happened, and I'm the man that saw it." Della's hands were shaking now, holding the Bible. She turned the page, hardly knowing why, just needing to hold on to the thing, and something slipped inside the pages. A folded paper, tucked deep, back in the book of Deuteronomy, where nobody flips to by accident. "Go on," Amos said. "That's the other thing. Read it." She unfolded it. It was in a different hand again, a neater one, but at the bottom was her father's signature, that same signature, weak and shaky, where the earlier one had been strong, but his. It was a will. I, Emmett Calloway, being sick but of sound mind, it began. And it went on plain and short the way her father talked. It named the Bar Sea, all its land and all its cattle, and every last thing on it, and it named his heir. One heir. His daughter, Della Calloway, sole and entire. At the bottom, below Emmett's shaking name, were 2 witness lines. One said Amos Teague. The other said a name Della knew, Harlan Webb, who kept the general store in Cold Fork. "He had me fetch Harlan out from town when he took sick," Amos said. "Third day he was down, when he could still talk clear. He knew what was coming. He dictated it, and Harlan wrote it fair, and your daddy signed it, and Harlan and me both witnessed it. Then he made me hide it in the book and keep the book right here." The old man's voice dropped. He didn't trust his brother. Even then, even before, he knew what Josiah was. Della stood in that dim-tack room, holding 2 pieces of paper that changed everything. The marriage, the will, her mother's name in her father's hand, her own name written as sole heir by the same weak hand that had once wrapped strong around hers on the branding iron. It was all here. It had been here the whole time. Not 30 feet from where they'd carried her cot, while a lawyer told a room full of men she was nobody. She understood, standing there, that she knew something now that Josiah did not. Josiah was out there, this very minute certain there was no paper anywhere, arranging his cattle sale, sleeping easy. And he was wrong. And he had no idea he was wrong. And only Della and one old man on earth knew it. That's a kind of power. Holding a truth the other man doesn't know you hold. But then she looked at Amos, and she saw the fear come up in his face, and she understood the price of it too. "Girl," he said, and his old hands twisted together. "You got to think careful now. If you take this to your uncle, if he knows I've got this, if he knows I'll swear to it." He stopped. He looked older than she'd ever seen him. "I'm 63 years old. This ranch is the only place I've worked near half my life. It's my roof and my wage and my whole life's all bound up in it. Josiah finds out I mean to stand against him. He'll turn me off this place before sundown, and he'll see to it no outfit in the territory hires an old man who crossed the man that owns the grass." His voice cracked. "Just a little. I want to do right by your daddy." "I do. But I'm scared, girl. I've got to tell you honest. I'm scared of what it costs me." And there it was. The thing she was holding wasn't just proof. It was a loaded thing, and the man who had to fire it was afraid it would go off in his own hand. Della closed the Bible gently over both papers. She held it against her chest. She'd walked into that tack room the lowest she'd ever been, believing the paper had beaten her for good. She was walking out of it, holding the very paper that could win, and understanding, for the first time, that the fight was only starting, and that the one weapon she had came wrapped in another man's fear. She looked at old Amos Teague in the dim light, the man who'd stood beside her father twice now, at a wedding and a deathbed, and who might not be able to stand beside her a third time when it counted most. "Nobody knows about this," she said quietly. "Not yet. Not until I say." Amos nodded, slow, and out across the yard, up at the house that used to be hers, the lamps were being lit for supper, and Josiah Calloway was sitting in her father's chair, counting cattle he didn't own, certain to the bottom of his cold heart that there was no name, no paper, and no daughter left to stop him. He had no idea what had just been found in the tack room. Not yet. Morning came the way it always did, gray over the ridge, indifferent to who owned the grass beneath it. Della was up before the cook. She saddled her own horse now, a plain bay gelding nobody had bothered to take from her, and she rode out to the herd like any hand-drawing wage. That was the first part of what she decided in the dark of the bunkhouse. Say nothing. Show nothing. Let them think the fight had gone out of her on those land office steps. But she'd decided a second thing too, and the second thing needed a judge. Cold Fork had no courthouse of its own. Twice a year the circuit came through, and the man who wrote it was Judge Halloran, a spare old lawman with reading spectacles and a way of listening that made a person feel measured. Della waited until Josiah rode to town on his own business. Then, she took the bay north to the county seat, 2 days hard travel, and she sat in a plank hallway outside the judge's chamber for the better part of an afternoon, her hat in her lap, her back straight. When they let her in, she did not weep, and she did not beg. She told him her name. She told him she was the daughter of Emmett James Calloway of the Bar C, and that a claim on that ranch had been laid over her by a man who said she had no lawful right to her own father's name. She asked him for one thing. A hearing, a proper hearing, on the record, with sworn testimony, where the matter of her birth and her father's estate could be settled in front of witnesses and not on a set of stone steps. Halloran studied her a long moment over the tops of his spectacles. "You understand," he said, "that the burden falls on you. The county record shows no marriage. A hearing is not a gift. If you cannot prove what you claim, I will have to rule against you, and it will be final." "I understand it," Della said. "And you still want it. I want it." He wrote something in a ledger. He set the point of his pen down and told her the circuit would sit at the Cold Fork land office in 21 days. He would hear the matter of the Bar C then. She could bring what she had. 21 days. She rode home, carrying the number like a coal in her hand. Now the hard part started, and the hard part was the waiting. Because she had it. She had the Bible with her mother's and father's names in ink and old Amos Teague's signature under them, dated 1864. She had the will folded into the book of Deuteronomy, naming her sole heir, witnessed by Amos and by Harlan Webb, who kept the store in town. She had the thing that would win, and she could not show it. Not yet. If Josiah learned it existed before she stood in front of the judge, he would find a way to lose it, or burn it, or wear the old Foreman down until the paper had no living witness left to speak for it. So she carried the winning card face down, and she smiled at supper, and she rode the herd, and she let them all believe she had folded. That was the strategy. It cost her more than the bunkhouse had. Josiah, for his part, moved like a man who'd already won. He had. As far as he knew. He sat in Emmett's chair at the head of the long table, and he talked freely about the ranch as his, the herd as his, the future as his. Della sat where he'd put her, at the far end, near the door, where the plate got slid down to her like something passed to a stray. She ate what was on it. She said little. One evening he was in high color, having ridden to town and come back pleased. The Cold Fork Cattlemen's Bank held a note on the Bar C, $4,200, and it was coming due inside 30 days. Josiah had gone in to make his arrangement. He'd cut 200 head out of the 900 to sell against that note, clear the debt, and keep the rest fat and free. He'd even talked the bank into an advance on the sale, money in hand before the cattle walked. He told the table all of it like a man reading his own good fortune aloud. Man plans, he said, lifting his cup. That's the whole of it. Man plans, and the weak wait to be told what happens to them. Down the table, Della kept her eyes on her food and let the words go by. Royce laughed. Royce laughed at most of what his father said. He was 24, and he wore Emmett's hat pushed back on his head like he'd been born under it, and he rode Emmett's sorrel out every morning just to be seen on it. He had his father's certainty without any of the years that might have earned it. Across the room, at the smaller table where the hands ate, old Amos Teague sat with his coffee and did not look up. Della had learned not to look at him either. A glance held too long was a thing Josiah might read. That was the first cycle. Act normal. Wait, watch her uncle spend inheritance he didn't own, out loud, in front of the very daughter who could take it back. The irony sat in Della's chest like a warm stone. She fed it, and she kept quiet. The near thing came 4 days later. She was in the shadow of the barn, coiling a rope, when she heard Josiah's voice around the corner in the tack room and stopped where she stood. He had Amos in there. Alone. 40 years, Josiah was saying, and the friendliness in it was the worst part. 40 years my brother had you on this place. Longest hand he ever kept. Man like you, Amos. You'd know a thing if there was a thing to know. Don't take your meaning, Amos said. His voice was careful, old and careful. My meaning's plain. My brother and that woman on the trail. If there was ever a paper, a preacher, a name written down anyplace, you'd have seen it. You saw everything on this ranch. A silence. Della pressed her back to the boards and did not breathe. I witnessed nothing, Amos said at last. That's right. Josiah's voice went soft and pleased. You witnessed nothing. Say it again so I know you've got it straight. There's no room here for an old man who misremembers. You want to finish your years under this roof, you witnessed nothing. There was no marriage. There is no paper. That girl is my brother's mistake, and nothing more. Say it. Another silence, longer. Della's whole life hung inside it. She heard the fear in the old man's breathing before she heard his words, and she understood, standing there in the barn's shadow, that she had asked this frightened man to carry something heavier than he might be able to lift. I got no paper to show you, Josiah, Amos said finally. Slow, each word set down like a foot on ice. I'm an old man. My memory's a poor thing these days. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was a man buying himself time, and Josiah took it for surrender because surrender was what he expected from everyone. Good, Josiah said. See you keep it poor. Boots crossed the floor. Della slid around the far side of the barn and busied her hands with the rope until her uncle passed by out in the yard, whistling, and never saw her at all. When he was gone, she leaned her forehead against the boards and let her breath come back. He'd suspected. He'd come sniffing right up to the door of the thing, and Amos had turned him with half a truth. Relief went through her so hard her knees felt loose. But under the relief was the cold understanding that the old man had not lied for her, and had not spoken for her either. He'd only stepped sideways. When the day came that stepping sideways wasn't allowed anymore, she did not know which way he'd fall. She let none of it show at supper. That was the whole discipline of those weeks. Feel the fear, eat the plate, say goodnight. Then, Josiah did the thing that made it permanent. The spring calves were on the ground, better than 200 of them, and every one carried the bar C on its hip, the mark Emmett had burned into that country for 40 years. It was Emmett's hand in iron. It was the closest thing to his signature that walked and breathed. And Josiah, wanting the ranch to be his all the way down to the hide, ordered the calves rebranded. A new mark, his mark, burned right over the bar C, so the old iron underneath went to a scar, and the new one sat on top. They lit the fires in the branding pen on a bright cold morning. Della was made to work it like any hand, dragging calves to the fire. And she did, because refusing would have told them she still cared, and caring was the one thing she couldn't afford to show. So she worked. She smelled the singed hair and the hot iron, and watched her father's mark disappear under her uncle's, one calf after another, and she kept her face flat as a stone. Royce ran one of the irons. He liked it. He liked the smoke and the bawling, and the power of laying a new name over an old one. He caught her watching once, and grinned at her across the fire, Emmett's hat on his head, the iron glowing in his fist. "Sorry, cousin," he called. "Not sorry at all. Guess it's ours now." Right down to the leather. He set the iron to a calf's hip. The bar C vanished under the fresh burn. Della straightened up from the calf she'd been holding. She looked at him across the fire, level, and her voice when it came was quiet enough that the men had to still to hear it, and steady enough that they did. "Burn it as deep as you like," she said. "My father wrote my name where fire can't reach." Royce's grin faltered, just for a second, because he didn't know what she meant and it unsettled him not to know. Then he covered it with a laugh and turned back to the fire. He thought it was grief talking. He thought it was a beaten girl saying a beaten thing. Nobody at that fire but Della knew it was a promise. 19 days. Then 20. Then the 21st came up gray and cold, and the circuit sat at the Cold Fork Land Office to hear the matter of the bar C. The same room. That was the cruelty of it, and Della felt it walking in. The very room where the lawyer had laid the empty ledger and the townsman had watched her turned away. The same clerk, Dawes, at the same rail. The same faces gathered along the walls, because a hearing like this was better than a show, and word had gone all through the country. Josiah had brought his lawyer up from the county seat, a smooth, flat-eyed man named Vance who wore a black coat and carried a leather case like it held the last word on earth. Josiah sat in the front with Royce beside him, and Royce, God help him, still had Emmett's hat on his knee. Judge Halloran took his place behind the land clerk's high desk. He set his spectacles on his nose. He called the room to order and stated the matter plain. The estate of Emmett James Calloway, deceased, the question of one Della Calloway, who claimed to be his lawful daughter and heir, against the standing claim of his brother Josiah as next of kin. The burden, he reminded them, lay with the girl. Vance rose first, and he was good, and he was quick. He walked to the desk and laid the county record open before the judge, the same book, the same blank where a marriage ought to be and wasn't. "Your Honor will see," he said. "There is nothing, no record of any marriage between Emmett Calloway and the woman the girl names as her mother. Not in this county, not in the territory so far as any office can find. A marriage that leaves no mark, left no marriage. In law, this young woman is no lawful daughter, and the estate passes to the nearest lawful kin, which is my client. There is nothing to hear, Your Honor. There is only a blank page and a sad story told over it." He said it well. Della watched the judge's face as he turned the blank leaf under his fingers, and she saw the thing she dreaded. Halloran was a fair man, but he was a man bound to paper, and the paper in front of him was empty. He looked at Della and there was something almost like regret in it. "Miss Calloway," he said, "you asked for this hearing. You said you could bring what you had. The record is bare. What do you bring me?" This was the moment. This was where the whole plan came to its edge. Because Della's proof was not a thing she could lay on the desk by her own hand and have it mean anything. A Bible could be written in by anybody. A will needed its witness alive and willing to swear. The paper was only as good as the living man behind it. And the living man was not in the room. Amos Teague's seat was empty. She had told him the day and the hour, and she had watched the yard that morning and not seen him ride, and she had come to town alone hoping he would follow, and he had not. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands were cold. "I have a witness. To my parents' marriage, and to my father's will." "Then produce him," Halloran said, not unkindly. Vance smiled the smallest smile. The door at the back of the room stayed shut. Della stood in the long silence and felt the townsman's eyes on her, and she felt Josiah's certainty rolling off him like heat off a stove, and for one terrible stretch she believed she had lost. She had gambled on a frightened man, and the man had chosen his roof over the truth, the way frightened men mostly do. She had nothing to lay down. She stood there, with her father's name in her mouth, and no one to swear to it. Halloran waited. Then he drew a breath to speak, and Della knew from the shape of it that the next words were going to end her. The door opened. It let in the cold and the gray light and a slow scrape of boots, and every head in the room turned. Old Amos Teague stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and his gray head bare. 40 years of that ranch were in the stoop of his shoulders. He had ridden hard, and it showed on him. He came in out of the doorway and down the aisle between the watching townsmen, and he did not look at Josiah, and he did not look at Royce. He looked at Della. Just at Della. And then at the judge. "I'm the witness," he said. "My name's Amos Teague. I'd like to be sworn." Josiah came half out of his chair. Vance put a hand on his arm and pressed him back down, but the flat had gone out of the lawyer's eyes, and something careful had come into them. Halloran had the old man sworn. Amos put his rope-scarred hand where he was told and swore to tell the truth, and his voice was steadier now than it had been in that tack room. A man who has finally decided which way to fall is steadier than a man still choosing. "You've something to tell this court," Halloran said. "Tell it." "I do." Amos turned his hat slow in his hands. "I've been on the bar 63 years old now, and 40 of them working that ground for Emmett Calloway. I was there before this man was. Before his boy was thought of." He didn't nod at Josiah, but the room knew who he meant. "In the spring of 1864, I was on the trail drive with Emmett, moving cattle north, and there was a young woman traveling with the outfit name of Ada Marie Sumner. And on the 11th day of May that year, 1864, I stood up under an open sky, and I watched a circuit preacher marry Emmett Calloway and Ada Sumner, man and wife, before God and before the outfit. I was a witness to it. The preacher wrote it down in the family book because there was no courthouse within 300 miles of where we stood. And I put my own name under it. The room had gone dead still. "And I've got the book," Amos said. He reached inside his coat and brought it out, the wooden box gone, just the Bible now, worn at the corners, and he carried it up to the high desk and set it in front of the judge with both hands the way a man sets down something holy. He opened it to the page, the marriage page. Emmett James Calloway and Ada Marie Sumner, in old ink, the 11th day of May, 1864, and beneath, in a rougher hand, witnessed, Amos Teague. "That's my name," Amos said. "That's my hand. I wrote it standing on the prairie with the wind trying to take the page, and I'd know it in the dark." Halloran bent over the page with his spectacles down his nose. He was a long time looking. Vance was on his feet. "Your Honor, a book. Anyone can pen a line in a book. This proves a man can write. It proves nothing of a wedding 20 years gone that no court ever saw. There's more, Amos said, before the judge could answer. There's the will. That took the room's breath a second time. He turned the pages himself, careful, to the book of Deuteronomy, and from between the leaves he drew a folded paper gone soft at the creases. Emmett fell sick this last winter. Pneumonia. The third day he was down, he knew which way it was going, and he called for me and for Harlan Webb, that keeps the store in Cold Fork, and he dictated this. And he signed it. And Harlan wrote it fair, and we both put our names to it as witnesses. It says what Emmett wanted said. It leaves the Bar C, all of it, the land and the herd and the last nail in the barn, to his daughter Della, his only child, his lawful girl. He laid it on the desk beside the Bible. That's my name on it too. And Harlan Webb's. A bought liar, Vance said, sharp now, the smoothness gone. Your Honor, this man works for the girl's family. He has eaten off that ranch for 40 years. He'll say anything to keep his place. This is testimony bought with a roof over his head, and I ask the court to see it for what it is. And here was the thing Della had not planned, and could not have. Amos turned and looked at Vance. And then he looked at Josiah, straight on for the first time since he'd come through the door. Bought, the old man said quietly. Mister, if I'd wanted to keep my place, I'd have kept my mouth shut. This man told me plain, not 2 weeks back, that if I remembered anything, I'd be off the Bar C before sundown, and no outfit in the territory would hire me after. I'm 63. I've got no land and no kin, and this was the only roof I had left. I came here today knowing I'd likely lose it. You want to tell this court what I bought myself by walking through that door? I bought myself out of a job and out of a home. The only thing I bought was the chance to quit lying for a man who asked me to. Nobody in the room moved. Even Vance had nothing ready for that. Halloran let the silence sit. Then he did the careful thing, the thing that made him the man he was. He did not take the old foreman's word alone. This second witness, he said. Harlan Webb. Is he in the county? He's outside, Your Honor, Amos said. I stopped by his store on my way and told him where I was bound. He closed up and followed. He's in the street. They sent for him. Harlan Webb came in, dusting his hands on his apron, a heavy plain man who kept a plain store, and he was sworn, and Halloran showed him the will without a word and asked him only whether he knew it. Webb looked at it a moment. That's the will I wrote out for Emmett Calloway this last winter, at his sickbed, in his own words, he said. That's my hand in the body of it. That's my name at the bottom, and that there's Amos Teague's name beside mine, and I watched him sign it same as I watched Emmett say every word. He set his thick finger by the date. 3rd day of Emmett's fever. I remember it because I thought he wouldn't last the week, and I was right. Near enough. He knew what he was doing. He was clear as you or me. He wanted that girl to have it, and he was afraid his brother would try for it, and he said so, right out while I held the pen. Halloran brought the county ledger, the marriage page in the Bible, and the will side by side on the high desk. He compared the ink of the will to Webb's own hand, where Webb signed the court's oath book right there in front of them. He weighed the dates against the store's account ledger Webb had thought to bring, the winter entries that put both men at the ranch those very days. He took his time. The whole room held while an old judge in reading spectacles moved his eyes back and forth between the papers and matched what could be matched. Then he set his spectacles down. The ink agrees, Halloran said. The dates agree. The hand of the will agrees with the hand of the man who says he wrote it, and that man came here of his own feet and gains nothing but trouble by it. The marriage is witnessed. The will is witnessed twice, by hands I can put in the same room on the same days by this store's own account book. A county record is a convenience, gentlemen. It is not the marriage. The marriage happened whether the county wrote it down or not, and I have 2 sworn men who stood in the room where it and the will were made. He looked at Della then, over the tops of his spectacles, and something in his spare old face had eased. I find that Emmett James Calloway and Ada Marie Sumner were lawfully married in 1864. I find that Della Calloway is their lawful daughter and the lawful heir of Emmett Calloway under his will. The estate of the Bar C, the land and all its stock, is hers. The claim of the brother is denied. The gavel came down once, flat and final, and it was the loudest thing in the world. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then, the room let out its held breath all at once, a low rush of it, and along the walls the townsmen stirred and murmured. The same men who had watched her turned out on the steps, and Della stood in the middle of it, and did not move, and did not cry, though her eyes stung, because she had promised herself a long time ago she would not give them tears in this room ever again. Josiah was on his feet. His face had gone the gray of old ash. "There's no record," he said, and his voice came out wrong, too loud, cracked at the edge. "There's no record. I looked. I had it looked." "The book was empty, Your Honor. The book is empty. You saw it." He put his hand flat on the county ledger like he could press the truth back into it. "It was empty." "The book was empty," Halloran said. "The marriage was not. You confused the one for the other, Mr. Calloway. Many men do. It costs most of them less than it's about to cost you." And he turned away from Josiah as from a matter already closed. Josiah stood there with his hand on the ledger and no more words in him, and slowly the loudness went out of him, and then the color, and then he simply stopped. A man who had counted and never once thought to count the men around him. He sat back down. He did not speak again. Halloran's eye moved to Royce, and to the hat on Royce's knee. "Young man," the judge said. "That hat." Royce looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there. Emmett's hat, sweat darkened at the band, shaped over years to a dead man's head. "That belonged to Emmett Calloway," Halloran said. "By this ruling it belongs to his daughter, along with everything else you've been wearing and riding that was his. I'd give it back. Now in front of the room, so there's no question later whose it is." The whole room was watching him. Royce's face went red and then white. He'd worn that hat like a crown for weeks, out where every hand could see, and now he had to carry it across a courtroom floor and hand it to the cousin he'd grinned at over a branding fire. He got up slow. He crossed to Della. He held it out and would not meet her eyes, and she took it from him without a word, and he went back to his seat with his own head bare and his ears burning. And that was the end of Royce Calloway's certainty. Contempt had made him careless, and careless men are the last to see the floor come up. At the side of the room, near the back, sat the aunt, Josiah's wife, the woman who had run that kitchen these last weeks, and had seen to it personally that Della's plate went to the far end of the table like a thing handed to a dog. She had said nothing this whole hearing. Now, when Della's eyes found her, she gave a small nod, tight and cornered, the nod of a woman who has just watched the floor of her life tilt and knows there's nothing to hold to. Then she looked down at her hands and did not look up again. Della held her father's hat against her chest, the way she'd held the Bible in the tack room, and she turned to face her uncle one last time. She did not raise her voice. She had never once raised it, not on the steps, not at the fire, not here, and she did not raise it now. The room went quiet to hear her, the same townsmen, the same walls, the same place they had watched her broken. "You told this town I had no name," she said to Josiah, level and clear. "The man who never left this ranch carried it for you all along. You only ever counted your own." Josiah did not answer. There was nothing in him to answer with. She turned from him. Across the crowded room old Amos Teague stood with his hat still in both hands, the witness who had finally spoken, and he met her eyes and held them, and neither of them said a thing, because there wasn't a thing that needed saying that the last hour hadn't already said out loud. Dawes the clerk, who had watched her turned away from that very rail, drew up the deed that same afternoon, reissued in the name of Della Calloway, sole owner of the Bar C. Halloran, signed it. The gavel had already done the rest. She rode home that evening, owning the ground under her horse. Josiah and Royce were gone from the house inside the week. There was no scene about it. There didn't need to be. A ruling like that emptied a man out, and Josiah packed and rode and took his boy